What Carlos Alcaraz just admitted after losing to Frances Tiafoe has stunned everyone around the ATP Tour. Not because he lost an exhibition match, but because the truth he revealed afterward completely changes how we understand his mindset, his physical condition, and the rivalry that defines the future of the sport. This wasn't about Tiafoe. This wasn't about the score. This was about something deeper happening inside Alcaraz, something he finally decided to address publicly, and something that might reshape his entire approach heading into 2026. When Alcaraz stepped on the court in Newark, it had been 21 days since his body broke down in Turin. 21 days since the hamstring injury that stopped his run at the ATP Finals and forced him to withdraw from the Davis Cup. Fans expected rust. They expected hesitations. But what nobody expected was the emotional clarity that would come after the match. A clarity that revealed exactly why he lost, and why, in a strange way, this might be the best thing that could have happened to him. From the very first rallies, it was obvious Alcaraz wasn't playing at full intensity. Not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't. Every movement was calculated. Every step carried a hint of caution. He wasn't the explosive version of himself. He wasn't the instinctive, fearless fighter who dives into rallies without thinking. He was measured, controlled, almost deliberately reserved. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to hide it. Tiafoe played freely, chasing the moment, feeding off the energy in the arena. Alcaraz, meanwhile, looked like a player trying to listen to his body more than the score. That's why the match unfolded the way it did. One great set from each, and then a super tiebreak where Tiafoe simply had more rhythm, more sharpness, more immediate match instincts. After 3 weeks without competing and after coming off a muscular injury that shook his confidence at the end of the season, Alcaraz didn't have the automatic reactions he usually relies on. And he knew it. But the reason he lost wasn't injury. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was rhythm, something no amount of training can replicate. Something only real competition can restore. That's why what he revealed afterward was so surprising. Because he didn't blame the injury. He didn't blame rust. He didn't blame the lack of preparation. Instead, he admitted that this match exposed a truth he had been trying to ignore. He is not mentally where he wants to be yet. Not emotionally sharp enough. Not competitively ruthless enough. Not fully reconnected with the version of himself that dominated the tour earlier in the year. But the moment he said it, you could feel the shift. He wasn't frustrated. He wasn't disappointed. He was relieved. Because acknowledging this weakness is exactly what allows him to fix it. What people forget is that Alcaraz lives in a constant conflict. He complains about the demanding calendar, yet he accepts exhibition matches all over the world. Critics attack him for it. Fans question the logic. But for Alcaraz, exhibitions are not about money, glamour, or attention. They are the safest and smartest way to rebuild rhythm without risking the emotional and physical strain of a full tournament. And deep down, he knows he needs rhythm more than anything right now, especially with the Australian Open approaching. The truth is simple. Alcaraz didn't lose because he is behind Tiafoe. He lost because he isn't caught up with himself yet. And there was another layer to his reveal. Something fans noticed instantly. Every time he spoke about the match, about his physical condition, about the upcoming exhibitions and the training block waiting for him in Spain, his tone shifted when the topic of Sinner came up. Not because he fears him, but because he knows that the rivalry is bigger than both of them now. It shapes everything. How they train, how they recover, how they plan their seasons, how they handle pressure. Alcaraz understands that every weakness he shows, every hesitation, every inch of lost rhythm, will matter when he steps on court against Sinner. Because Sinner is relentless. Sinner is precise. Sinner is emotionally stable in ways that most players his age are not. And Alcaraz knows that he cannot face Sinner at anything less than full intensity. That's why he didn't hide anything after his defeat to Tiafoe, because this match wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The beginning of rebuilding momentum. The beginning of reconnecting with his identity. The beginning of preparing mentally and physically for the rivalry that defines the new era of tennis. And the craziest part is that the fans in Newark could feel it. Even in defeat, Alcaraz looked lighter, more honest, more aware of what he needs to fix. And when he said the words that explained everything, "I didn't have the rhythm to take risks," you could sense that he finally understood the path back to his best self. He's not lost. He's recalibrating. And the entire tennis world should pay attention to what comes next. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to World News Tennis, the only channel that tells you what's really happening behind Alcaraz, Sinner, and the future of the ATP Tour. The most surprising moment came not during the match, but in the quiet minutes afterward, when Alcaraz finally explained what had really happened on that court. He didn't speak like someone who had been beaten. He spoke like someone who had finally understood something essential about himself. He admitted that the biggest challenge wasn't the injury, and it wasn't Tiafoe. It was the simple fact that he hadn't felt like a competitor for almost a month. And for a player like Alcaraz, who depends on rhythm, instinct, and emotion, losing that connection is more damaging than any physical setback. He said something that revealed everything. "My body is ready. My mind needs to catch up." That line alone told the entire story. Because tennis for Alcaraz has never been just about mechanics or tactics. It's always been about energy, flow, momentum. That fire inside him that turns tough points into highlight reels. And after 3 weeks away, not training at full intensity, not competing, not using his explosive movement, that energy felt distant. Not gone, but not fully accessible either. This is where the contrast with Sinner becomes impossible to ignore. Sinner can go long stretches without competition and still come back sharp because his style thrives on structure and repetition. His game is built like a machine, calibrated, clean, stable. But Alcaraz is built like a storm. He needs chaos. He needs adrenaline. He needs the emotional engagement that comes from real battle. Without it, his game becomes too controlled, too cautious, too predictable. And that's exactly what the Tiafoe match exposed. But something else happened in that exhibition. Something more subtle, but far more important. Alcaraz tested himself emotionally. Every time he hesitated on a forehand, every time he held back on a sprint, every time he chose safety instead of explosiveness, he was measuring himself, listening to his body, teaching himself where the line was. And the moment he realized he could push without pain, everything changed. The fear started to dissolve. That's why the result didn't matter. Because this match wasn't a competition, it was a test. A controlled environment for him to confront the uncertainty still lingering from Turin. A chance to see whether the injury had left any psychological scars. And by the end of the night, he knew the answer. The injury wasn't the problem anymore. The missing rhythm was. And that's exactly why the next weeks of preparation will be the defining moment of his 2026 season. Alcaraz knows he can't hide behind exhibitions forever. He knows the real emotional test isn't Tiafoe or João Fonseca or mixed doubles with Pegula. The real test is Sinner, the one opponent who demands absolute clarity, absolute confidence, absolute rhythm. This rivalry has grown into something larger than both players. It dictates how they train, how they schedule their season, how they think during moments of doubt. Even when they're not facing each other, they're preparing for each other. And that's why Alcaraz's reveal after the Tiafoe match matters so much. Because for the first time, he admitted publicly that he wasn't mentally sharp enough to take risks. And risks are the foundation of his game. The reason he breaks patterns, the reason he disrupts rhythm, the reason he forces even the best defenders into panic. When Alcaraz plays without risk, he becomes ordinary. When he embraces risk, he becomes unstoppable. But there was something else in his voice after the match, a quiet confidence that didn't come from the performance, but from the realization that this version of him is temporary. This isn't decline. This isn't fear. This is recalibration. And recalibration is exactly what precedes a breakthrough. Alcaraz said he felt good enough to push again. Those words matter more than any statistic from the match. Because being able to push physically means he can finally start pushing mentally. And once the mind and body align, the explosiveness returns. The instinct returns. The chaos returns. And when that happens, Sinner will once again face the version of Alcaraz that no one in the world knows how to control. But the most fascinating part came when he spoke about the upcoming match in South Korea, the exhibition against Sinner just 8 days before the Australian Open. His tone changed instantly. Not nervous, not hesitant, but hungry. Because he knows that match will be the real signal of where he stands. And deep inside, he knows Sinner will use it to measure him too. Their rivalry isn't personal. It's evolutionary. One pushes the other to grow. One exposes the weaknesses of the other. One forces the other to evolve. And Alcaraz knows that if he fixes the rhythm problem, everything else falls into place. What he revealed after losing to Tiafoe wasn't an excuse. It was a roadmap. A way to understand why the match unfolded the way it did, and why the next version of Alcaraz will be stronger, freer, and more dangerous than anything we saw in late 2025. He wasn't defeated. He was awakening. When Alcaraz landed in Miami for the second exhibition, something about him looked different. Not physically. His movement was still cautious, his step still measured, but emotionally. There was a sense of calm around him, the kind that appears only after a player confronts the truth he has been avoiding. Losing to Tiafoe hadn't damaged his confidence. It had clarified it. And that shift mattered far more than any exhibition scoreline. During practice the next morning, observers noticed something subtle but important. Alcaraz was experimenting again. He tried drop shots from uncomfortable positions. He went for inside-out forehands from spots on the court where most players would reset the point. He tested his flexibility on wide balls instead of pulling back. These weren't tactical decisions. They were psychological ones. He was teaching his mind to trust his body again. Ferrero, watching from the sidelines, didn't interrupt. He knew exactly what was happening. This was the stage where instincts slowly reawaken. Not in a match. Not under pressure. But in the quiet hours of practice, where the brain rewires itself point by point, movement by movement, until confidence stops being forced and becomes natural again. But the match against João Fonseca that awaited him wasn't the real storyline. The real storyline was what this period was revealing about Alcaraz's internal state. Because as the days went by, he started speaking differently about the upcoming season. More direct, more serious, more aware of the emotional gaps he needed to fill. And every time he talked about his recovery, he inevitably circled back to one topic: rhythm. Rhythm isn't a statistic. It can't be measured by speed, distance, or duration. Rhythm is emotional timing, the connection between instinct and execution that separates the merely talented from the truly elite. And Alcaraz's entire game depends on it more than any player of his generation. Without rhythm, he hesitates before dropping a shot. Without rhythm, he chooses safety over chaos. Without rhythm, he becomes mindful at moments where he should be fearless. It wasn't just that he lacked rhythm in Newark. It was that he realized how much he depends on it to be himself. This is where his rivalry with Sinner becomes impossible to ignore. Because Sinner is the one opponent who exposes every lapse in rhythm. His clean hitting, his stability, his refusal to panic. All of that forces Alcaraz into rapid, instinctive decisions. If those instincts are not fully alive, Alcaraz loses the advantage. That's why the Tiafoe match mattered more than the scoreboard. It showed him how far he still is from the emotional sharpness required to face Sinner. Yet something in his voice suggested he was embracing this challenge rather than fearing it. He described Tiafoe's precision in the super tiebreak as exactly what I expected, and then said something deeper. I wasn't ready to match that intensity yet. There was no frustration, no excuses, just honesty. Honesty that reveals self-awareness. And self-awareness is the first step toward transformation. The most telling moment came when he reflected on the final points of the match. He said he felt his instincts coming and going, like signals that flickered on and off depending on his comfort level. That metaphor made Ferrero pause. Because it showed that Alcaraz wasn't simply feeling rusty, he was navigating the emotional residue of an injury that had disrupted his identity. To understand Alcaraz's current mindset, you have to understand the psychological impact of injuries on explosive players. For someone whose entire game relies on acceleration, elasticity, and sudden changes of direction, even a healed muscle can create doubt. The body may be ready, but the mind remembers the moment it failed. And until the mind is convinced, nothing flows. That's why these exhibitions were never about entertainment. They were about exposure, exposing the uncertainty, exposing the hesitation, exposing the parts of Alcaraz's game that had remained dormant since Turin. And little by little, those parts began to wake up. During media obligations in Miami, he spoke about his rivalry with Sinner in a way he hadn't before. He said, "We push each other because we see exactly what the other one has." It was a subtle but powerful message. A message that acknowledged the truth. Sinner's consistency forces Alcaraz to refine his impulses. Alcaraz's unpredictability forces Sinner to sharpen his patterns. Their rivalry isn't built on animosity. It's built on evolution. And evolution requires moments like the ones Alcaraz is living now. Moments of vulnerability, moments of truth, moments where the path back to dominance isn't physical, but emotional. One journalist asked him if he felt pressure returning to competition after the injury. He shook his head and said something unexpectedly mature. "The pressure is there whether I play or not. The only question is how I use it." Ferrero later said that this line was the clearest sign yet that Alcaraz was beginning to shift mentally. Because using pressure instead of resisting, it is exactly what separates experienced champions from emerging ones. The exhibition in Seoul against Sinner was mentioned repeatedly in these interviews. Not as revenge, not as a test of supremacy, but as a checkpoint. A place where both players will measure their evolution. Alcaraz didn't hide it. He admitted he wants to walk into Melbourne knowing he has already faced the one opponent who shapes his season more than anyone else. And that honesty, combined with the clarity he gained in Newark, is why this moment matters so much. He isn't just recovering. He's awakening a deeper version of himself. By the time the Miami exhibition approached its final day, the conversations around Alcaraz had changed completely. What started as concern about his injury had shifted into fascination with his transformation. Reporters, coaches, even former players watching from afar could sense it. Alcaraz wasn't just returning, he was rebuilding from the inside out. And the loss to Tiafoe, instead of weakening him, had become the spark behind a deeper, more intentional evolution. On the morning of his match against Fonseca, Ferrero watched him train with a focus that didn't look like the intensity from earlier seasons. This wasn't the raw fire of a teenager trying to prove his talent. This was something calmer, something sharper. A man preparing for the version of himself he wants to bring into 2026. Ferrero didn't need to say anything. He simply observed the rhythm returning point by point, breath by breath. But there was still one thing left to confront, the emotional shadow of the injury in Turin. And that shadow surfaced during one particular rally late in practice. Alcaraz stretched for a wide forehand, hesitated for a split second, and then decided to go for it. Sliding, accelerating, hitting through the ball without fear. Ferrero felt something inside him settle. That single decision told him more than the entire match in Newark. Instinct had returned. And instinct is the engine of Alcaraz's greatness. Later that day, during pre-match interviews, Alcaraz said something that summarized his entire journey over these past weeks. "I don't need to feel perfect. I just need to feel alive on the court again." That line resonated because it revealed the truth behind his style of play. Perfection has never been his goal. Expression has. Creativity has. Freedom has. And when he loses touch with those things, even for a moment, his game feels foreign to him. The Fonseca match was another step forward, not because of the result, but because Alcaraz allowed himself to be dynamic again. He tried shots he wouldn't have dared to attempt in Newark. He chased points with an urgency that looked familiar. The muscle wasn't holding him back anymore, and more importantly, the fear wasn't either. His body moved like an athlete returning to form. His mind moved like a competitor returning to purpose. But the real turning point came after the match, when he was asked directly about facing Sinner in Seoul. Instead of the usual mix of diplomacy and respect, Alcaraz answered with clarity, "These matches help me feel like myself again. And when I feel like myself, I can beat anyone." He didn't say Sinner's name. He didn't need to. Everyone understood the subtext. Ferrero later admitted that this moment told him everything he needed to know about where Alcaraz was emotionally. Confidence isn't loud. Confidence is clarity. And Alcaraz was finally speaking with the clarity of someone who understands his own process. Someone who isn't afraid of rhythm temporarily slipping. Someone who sees exhibition matches not as a measure of level, but as milestones in a much larger preparation. And that preparation, whether he admits it publicly or not, revolves around one match, the Australian Open. Not because it's the only slam he hasn't won. Not because it's the season opener. But because it's the first real opportunity to test his evolution against Sinner under the bright lights, with pressure, stakes, and consequences. Both men know what that match would mean. Both know that the rivalry is entering a new phase. And both know that 2026 will be shaped by who adapts faster. As the hours passed and the Miami event ended, Alcaraz spent time watching matches, greeting fans, and absorbing the atmosphere of competition he had missed during his recovery. But even in those relaxed moments, Ferrero could see the internal shift. Alcaraz wasn't searching anymore. He wasn't questioning. He wasn't analyzing his injury or doubting his readiness. He had moved past that phase. Now he was preparing with a purpose, reclaiming the game that only he can play. What makes this period so important isn't that Alcaraz is healing. It's that he is rediscovering the emotional principles that define him. Joy, creativity, instinct, rhythm. Without those, he becomes ordinary. With them, he becomes the most dangerous player in the world. And Ferrero can sense that the pieces are aligning again, not perfectly, but authentically. And authenticity is what unlocks his highest level. As they flew back to Spain to begin the preseason, Ferrero looked at him and saw the version of Alcaraz he had been waiting for since the start of the injury. Grounded, hungry, emotionally open, physically confident, mentally lighter. A man ready to compete. A man ready to fight. A man ready to step into the rivalry that defines this era, not as the kid chasing history, but as a champion defending his identity. He's not fully there yet, but he's close. And that is exactly why the ATP should be nervous. Because a Carlos Alcaraz who plays from honesty instead of pressure is the most unpredictable force in modern tennis. And a Carlos Alcaraz who embraces rhythm instead of perfection is a nightmare for every top player, especially Jannik Sinner. If you love this rivalry as much as we do, hit subscribe right now to World News Tennis. Don't miss the truth, the analysis, and the future of Alcaraz versus Sinner, the greatest rivalry of this generation.